Yeah, hello and welcome to our lecture series on climate protection. Our guest today is Elisabeth Gsottbauer. Elisabeth is a senior researcher at the Department of Economics of the University of Innsbruck and an assistant professor research fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment of the London School of Economics. Her main research interest lies in environmental economics, behavior and experimental economics, evidence-based policy solutions for a sustainable transition, and promotion of behavior change among consumers and firms to drive positive environmental outcomes. Her presentation today. Sorry.
I just keep close to. Okay, so let's look at our leverage points. So CO2 emissions, the red line has been increasing since the 60s, only downturns when we were in economic crisis. Perfect correlation, GDP per capita. So we see if we increase our economic activity, we're also increasing our CO2 emissions. So they seem to be quite nicely correlated. Population, unsurprisingly, has also been increasing, quite a steady increase on the purple line. So everything is going up. This also means CO2 emissions are going up. Two things have been going down, which is good, right? Remember the factor technology, carbon intensity and energy intensity. Let's look first at energy intensity. Energy intensity has been even more successful, has been going down by roughly 30%. That means we have become way more energy efficient, meaning we use less energy to produce the same amount of economic output. That's good. So it seems that we have invested in a lot of energy efficient technology. Let's look at carbon intensity. Well, not so great, right? It has been going down, but it's quite flat the last years. And that means the carbon footprint of the energy we use has not changed much. So it has been going down by roughly 10%. The last years, where we think there has been this solar wind revolution, the carbon intensity has not changed much. But we most likely have to change the carbon footprint of the energy we use, meaning we still have to replace a lot of fossil fuels, gas, etc., by renewable energies, but we haven't done so much. Now let's look at this question from an economist's point of view. So the one thing you could say, policy-wise, let's say population, purple line we're not going to touch, it's a sensitive topic. Very few countries in the world are going to put regulation on populations. Okay, so next question, can we do something about GDP? So we see that both lines, CO2 and GDP, correlate quite widely. Why not just don't grow GDP? So can we reduce emissions while still growing the economy? Well, some would argue, should we degrow? Some would argue, can we further, can we reduce emissions while still increasing GDP? Let's see. On the global level, and here you see global CO2 emissions to the left, global GDP, and global population. Again, one factor of the Chi identity. On the global level, we have no evidence that this is possible. At the global level, CO2 has been rising and GDP has been rising. There's no evidence that it's possible that we grow on the global level and degrow, so to say, our carbon emissions. That's a bit of a problem for us because climate change is a global problem. It doesn't matter if we are emitting CO2 in Tyrol or in some other country or in England or in the US. So this is quite challenging. Nevertheless, there are little success stories. Here we look at a couple of individual countries, UK, France, Germany, Sweden, the States, and Finland. The blue lines is GDP per capita, which has more or less been increasing besides some economic downturns. And we see that in all these developed countries, carbon emissions are falling, right? Look at the red lines. So that's great. So apparently it is possible that we grow our economic activity and at the same time, we reduce carbon emissions. So this process is usually referred to as decoupling, and it's possible at the national level. And you say, well, that's great. Going one slide back, well, it's not great because at the global level, we have not achieved that. And climate change or greenhouse gas emissions are not the national problem, so to say, but the global problem. Okay, so now we have looked into two leverage points. Can we do something about population? We have disregarded the topic, very sensitive. Can we do something about GDP? Well, we have shown at the national level that we don't have to do anything because apparently we can grow the economy and reduce emissions, but we seem to have a problem at the global level. So what is left? So what can we tackle with our policy? We can tackle energy intensity, and we can tackle carbon intensity, so the carbon footprint of the energy we use. What should we do when we tackle energy intensity? When we tackle energy intensity, we could renovate our houses, we could install more energy efficient isolation, buy more energy efficient fridges, install energy efficient technologies in companies, and so on. If we would like to do something about carbon intensity, we have to switch the energy we use. And at the moment, we still use a lot of natural gas, particularly also in Austria for heating, for instance, fossil fuels in our cars and so on, and need to replace them more because carbon intensity, as you remember, have only been decreasing very little in the future. All right, so I've shown you that would be good if we become more efficient, right? And would be good if we go a little bit more into the direction of technological substitution. So substituting our dirty energy, fossil fuels, natural gas, which has a very high carbon footprint, with clean energy, solar, wind, etc. There are two kind of problems with that. On the one hand, efficiency improvements, we haven't done so badly as you have seen over the years, but we should also be aware that there are limits in efficiency gains. There are a lot of potential for rebound effects. Rebound effects are if I have efficiency gains, and with these efficiency gains, I save some money, and with this money, I basically buy a second car, for instance, and then I use even more energy than before. So basically a rebound with my energy use, so that's not great. Technological substitution is ongoing, but as I have shown, the transition seems to be slower as one would expect. Think about the transition to electric cars or the transition from our heating system from natural gas to a lower carbon footprint as here in Austria. Okay, so if those two levers are going slow or have their problems, what can we do? We can look into demand side solution. Demand side solution means reducing energy consumption, basically influencing the demand of consumers and firms of not consuming as much energy as before. And demand side solutions is interesting because they have quite a big potential, so to say. So there are some studies. One is, all of them are amongst others by a team around Kreuziger, a professor in Berlin. And even the IPCC has now an own chapter on demand side interventions, and solution is that adjustment at the consumer level, meaning if you change to more lower carbon footprint lifestyles, for instance, with respect to the usage of public transport, the type of housing renovation, etc., or the type of food you eat, then these levers are quite big. So for instance, the IPCC report tells us that adjustments at the consumer level could technically allow reductions for up to 80% in the housing sector, 60% in transport, and 40% in food. So these are pretty big numbers. But for demand side solutions, and that will be a bit the core of my talk, we need to do two things. We need to understand behavior, and we need to figure out what works to achieve behavioral change. And what works, I mean, what interventions, what policies basically push people into changing their behaviors or adjusting their demand in reducing their total energy use related to transport, what people eat, and where the food is grown, housing, and so on. Okay, let's start with the first question. So what motivates behavior, or how can we conceptualize behavior? And what does this mean at best for policy interventions? Here I come into an economist's view, again, because this also will tell us a lot about policy. So if you ask an economist what motivates behavior, he will probably tell you about Homo economicus. And Homo economicus is quite simple. He wants to maximize his welfare, his or her welfare. He's quite self-interested. And when he or she makes decision, usually weights cost and benefits of some investment, for instance, and only if the benefits outweigh its cost, he or she might pursue this action. So according to Homo economicus, he's only going to respond to economic incentives, and his only limitation is the income he or she has. Well, from that perspective, we also learn a lot about policies, or which policies should work. So if I believe that people only respond to their limitations of income and that every decision is a cost-benefit decision, then I should probably put a lot of economic incentives to motivate people. And we do that, or partially we do. And I think that's the restart. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so everyone got a break. All right, so if you assume quite rational and self-interested behavior of consumers and producers, policy recommendations would be quite easy. We would just say, well, let's just change the economic incentives, meaning we are making more pollutive activities more expensive. We could do so through carbon pricing, could be carbon tax, could also be emission trading scheme. We could also motivate people with subsidies. We could give them rebates and subsidies for energy efficiency improvements, renovations, their electric cars. We also do that. And rational actors would also very well respond to standards and regulations. So if you are forbid to drive, for instance, a diesel car or something similar. Now, on the right-hand side, or most of you know, that's probably not the most realistic picture of behavior. So in many instances, we are influenced by much more than just a cost-benefit analysis. And another sub-branch of economics has realized that, and hopefully most economists have realized that. But in behavioral economics, we would say that there are many more motivators. When we make decisions, or we could be motivated by our moral obligations, by our values, identity, emotions, social influence, information we receive, social norms, etc. But then policy recommendations might look very different. Also to say we might need, and this will be the argument a little bit of this presentation, we might look into additional tools we could use. Because if we assume a way more richer model of behavior, we might look into information provision, education, awareness raising, new tools such as nudging, which I will explain in a bit, public recognition, rewards. We might also have to adjust our economic incentives because people might not react optimally to the tax levels we set, etc. So there are two models of behavior. I will skip that. I think I've been sending an old version of that, but it doesn't matter. So I'll give you two insights from behavioral economics, which I find useful to understand and also applicable to our case. So one view is that we not only care about it's very simple, we not only care about our own interests, but we care also about what other people do and about other people's welfare. And this Homo economicus would never assume in their model. So all economic models you see don't include that. But we know that much of our behavior is in fact influenced by how other people behave. And this is also referred to as social learning or norms, social proofs, our social identities, etc. But if we know this, that people care about what their friends do, what their family does, what the other students do, then we probably can also use it for interventions or for policy. We could, for instance, use it to try to make certain behaviors socially unacceptable, or try to make some certain behaviors socially acceptable, or use the power of some very influential people in order to influence behavioral change. There are many definitions of social norms or social influence. Economists have worked on it, psychologists have worked on it, sociologists, anthropology, you see here a couple. Newberg is a very good overview. They define a social norm as a predominant behavioral pattern within a group, supported by a shared understanding of acceptable actions, and they are sustained through social interactions within the group. There are a lot of examples of social norms, and social norms may also vary depending on the context you are, the country you're in, such as, for instance, different countries might have different norms for littering, to look into an environmental norm. Now, more importantly, okay, so now we know we have other motivators. For instance, other people motivate what we do. So how can we use it for behavior change? So one way we can use it is how one consultancy of energy utilities in the US has used it, so-called O-Power. It's a private company, and they figured out that people care what others do. And what they did, they provided customers with energy usage feedback in comparison to their neighbors. On the right-hand side, you see like a template of that usage feedback report, which households got. So households got every month a letter telling them how much energy they used, how much energy the most efficient neighbor used and how much energy on average all neighbors used. And their energy use was put into perspective to the most efficient neighbor as much as to all other neighbors. And then it was kind of rated that you were either rated that your energy usage is good or is bad or is very good. And the question is, does this impact behavior, right? So from a rational perspective, people should not change the behavior or adjust their energy usage. From the economic, psychology, behavioral economic literature, we, however, would say that it does impact behavior. And in fact, this is what Alcott et al. Found, 2011. He showed, so he looked at this study. Basically, there were 600,000 households. Half of the households received those type of energy usage feedback, where the other type of the households did not receive those letters. And he found that just by sending out those letters, telling people what other people do, energy consumption was reduced by an average of roughly 2%. One could say, yeah, it's very little, or let's call it a red effect. That is true. However, putting it in perspective to a price or monetary incentive, I think it's not too bad, because the effect is roughly equivalent to that of a short-run electricity price increase of 11 to 20%. And if we are not necessarily in an energy crisis, we are not usually raising our prices by 10 to 20%. So given that energy price increases by that amount are quite unrealistic, we can already do quite a bit with an information type of intervention. What we should also realize is that these effects are usually not constant across groups. They vary a lot. So there were obviously some usage groups, so those households who were using a lot of energy, they reduced energy consumption by up to 6%. While there were low consumption households and their energy usage was hardly affected, but this kind of makes sense because they could hardly move into lower consumption patterns. So yeah, two keywords when you look at those evaluations: treatment effect test, because it tells you a little bit how much an intervention changes behavior, and heterogeneity. This means just knowing the average effect might hide some stuff because some people might be more affected by it than others. This can also be proven in a meta-analysis, but I will also skip this point for a second and show you another insights from behavioral economics. So on the one hand, we know that people are influenced by other people's opinion. Another insights from behavioral economics, and on which Kahneman, who also got the Nobel Prize for it, has worked a lot in, is framing. Framing is quite easy concept. It refers to the presentation of some information in a way that influences how people perceive it, which can then influence their decisions as much as judgments. Framing is in fact considered a type of cognitive bias, as it influences how individuals perceive information and make decisions based on the mere way how it is presented, and not on the content itself. Okay, so if we know that, depending of how I frame a message, be it a policy message, an advertising campaign, some information about a house renovation or something similar, this might largely influence what people are going to do about it. Again, from a rational perspective, we would never expect anything just because I use a different wording that people would react to it, but in fact, the evidence tells us differently. From a policymaker's perspective, I should therefore, or intervention perspective, I should probably take care how I'm going to frame my message to effectively convey policies or interventions, and so encourage and decide behavioral change. So let's look at an example how this can be used for behavior. There's another field study, again in the US, which was run by Bollinger et al. And he used a real advertising campaign, so people get solar panels on their rooftops. They designed, in fact, two advertising campaigns. One they called rational or self-interest campaign, and the campaign was a bit focusing on that people could save money by installing solar over the long term, and they referred to it as appeals to self-interest. There was another campaign, it was called appeals to prosociality. And this advertising campaign tried to make sure to convey the message: if you're going to install solar panels or solar on your household rooftop, then this is good for the community, everyone is consuming low carbon energy, and we're all going to have more clean energy, and this benefits everyone, not only the individual household. Campaigns were launched in a randomized manner. Total, there were roughly 30 counties in it. They were equally split into the different advertising campaigns, and there was also a group of counties or provinces which in fact did not receive any advertising, so one could measure the effect in a controlled and clear way. The outcome measure these researchers were interested in were the amount of rooftop which was installed after the end of the advertising or during the advertising campaign. So which campaign was more successful? Let's look at the two campaigns. Very little differences. You see on the left, take control of high energy costs and save thousands through this unique solar opportunity. So this was the advertising campaign which tried to target people's self-interest. And the other advertising campaign on the right, our town is coming together as a community to offer solar energy to residents at discounted pricing. All right, so let's look at the results. So we have the same things people have to do. They either buy solar for the rooftop households, but they were targeted with different messages or a different framing of the message. Here are the results. Let me try to explain this to you. You see on the horizontal line time, months before, during, and after the campaign. At 0, the advertising campaign was launched, where you see the gray bar where the weeks the advertising campaign was effective. Everything was happened before is on the left of 0, and all the weeks from 0 to 20 are after or during the advertising campaign. We have 3 indicators of our 3 groups. There's the control group, which was the blue, which is the blue line, the pro-social group, which is the red line, and the self-interest group, which is the green line. And we have on the vertical axis how many solar installations took place by 1,000 owner-occupied houses. As solar installations were measured at the community or county level. And I think the effect is quite clear. We see that during the advertising campaign, the self-interest approach to telling people that they can save money with installing solar works very well, while the pro-social works a little bit better than no campaign. However, in the weeks after, pro-social and control basically converge, so there's not much difference, while there's still an effect, and that is surprising, on the self-interest group. Bottom line, it makes a difference how you're going to convey your message. Okay, so what do we learn from policy for this? In fact, for policy, we learn quite a bit. We could also say this is a type of new policy theory, and it was marked by other Nobel Prize winners, namely Thaler and Sunstein. You see here the book Nudges, which has been come out in a couple of versions and has sold already about 2 million copies. And we learned that people do not always make optimal or rational decisions. And because of that, so because of knowing that people deviate from rational behavior, people deviate from perfect self-interest, that we could use this, so knowing what that emotions, social norms, framing, cognitive biases, etc., influences people. We could also use this for interventions, and these interventions are usually summarized under nudging. And nudging have different definitions, but they are either slight pushes or subtle cues aimed at helping or guiding people's decisions or behavior. Without using coercion or prohibition. So no one is forced, or like not with a regulation, that no one is forced to do it. That is meant with coercion or prohibition, but nudges basically push you in some desired direction. And with desired direction, as an economist, we usually mean like it should increase your individual welfare or your social welfare or the social welfare for society. So when it comes to green behavior, we would like that people take up solar. We would like that people behave more pro-environmental friendly because it's good for society. Nudges are also used in a lot of personal domains. Think about usage of nudges for personal savings. So it would be good probably for your individual welfare if you save more money now, so you have some money for your pension, etc. So nudges are used to increase individual as much as social, or at best social welfare. Sometimes nudging is also referred to as choice or people who use, or policymakers who use nudges as choice architects. Choice architects, because what nudges do is to try to change the decision-making decision. Either they provide you information in a different way, or they are more hard interventions in the decision setting, and therefore the word architect is sometimes used. To summarize, Tal and Sunstein would say that any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any option or significantly changing their economic incentives would be called a nudge, or at least being referred to. At the moment where we use economic incentives, we are again in the standard policy toolbox. To count as a mere nudge, the intervention must be easy and cheap to avoid. Nudges are not mandates like laws or regulations or standards. So for instance, putting the food at eye level counts as a nudge. Banning junk food, so forbidding something or forbidding you to drive a diesel car, it's definitely not a nudge, it's a typical regulation or standard. Now, this new policy theory, sometimes referred under the name nudge, Tal and Sunstein has coined the term. Nowadays, we also use the word behavioral public policy. Behavioral public policy has been heavily influenced by Adam Oliver from the LSE, and he's written a couple of books on it, as much as Kay Sunstein, one of the main authors of the original nudge book. And they would say behavioral public policy is the use of behavioral insights. I've shown you two, about framing, about the influence of social norms or other people's behavior, to design effective and legitimate public policy. So with effective mean is something works. So I know that this intervention has an effect, that it changes behavior, and legitimate means that it is approved by those who have been intervened. There are tons of articles written on it, be it in English or German. You see something from The Economists, from the Financial Times, as much as there's also some reporting in the Standard about it. And it should not be underestimated. So nowadays one could say using behavioral insights for policy making or interventions is kind of a growing industry, and it has a growing influence at least. So we see it in a lot of governmental or sub-governmental agencies. The European Union, for instance, has its own competence center on behavioral insights. The World Bank has its own unit on mind behavior and development, where they use behavioral insights in order to design their development interventions. The FAO uses behavioral science in order to look at it with respect to food choices. The OECD uses behavioral insights as a type of observatory. There's also some Austrian agencies which have their own groups. There's the EIS in Vienna, which is one of the two economic institutes, EIS and WIFO. They have their own behavioral economics group, which do behavioral consulting for a lot of agencies in Vienna. And besides having like the feeds in government, there's a lot of industry, there are a lot of consultancies. You see behavioral groups in McKinsey, Deloitte, Accenture. You might have heard of the Behavioral Insights team, the BIT team. It's a UK-based team. It was in fact the original behavioral team, so I think it was founded 10 to 15 years ago, and it was part of the government in the UK. So it was, so to say, the first behavioral econ team or behavioral insight team within a governmental agency. Everything after that, European Union, World Bank, FAO, OECD, were founded in the spirits of the Behavioral Insight team. The Behavioral Insight team is now not anymore part of the UK government. I think they realized they can make more money outside the government, so they're now one of the biggest agency I'm aware of. And on the bottom right, you see also a map where someone took the effort to try to map also at the country, individual country level, if countries in governmental agencies have set up their own groups which they can consult when they design policies and interventions to help them make them kind of behaviorally proof. 2 slides on what's the theory behind these nudges, so why it should work. I mean, I've explained to you that there's 2 types of views. So economists think we're all rational, while behavioral economists would say, no, this is not the case. But in detail, everything comes out of this book, and I can very much recommend to read it, from Daniel Kahneman, who unfortunately has passed away this year, but he wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. And Thinking Fast and Slow, his origin is in fact from psychology, but he has turned into an economist later. He basically tells us that there are two ways of thinking, or that most of our decisions are either made in what he calls system 1 or system 2, and they're very easy to differentiate. System 1 is those decisions we make very quick, we make intuitive, they're very automatic. In these decisions, we probably rely on decision heuristics or spontaneous reactions, and usually these decisions require us very little effort. They require also very little attention, they go very quick. There are some decisions, even though you might have an opinion on that, which rely on system 2. We call them, they're analytical, they're slow, they're effortful. It requires a lot of thinking, attention. Mostly we might use it for very complex problems, big decisions. I would call it rather high-stake decisions. And Kahneman itself and Kay Sunstein would also agree on this, is that if we want to use nudging, so basically try to redesign the decision environment, most likely it should only work on system 1. So most likely it should only influence when we're very quick automatic decisions. Otherwise, if we think a lot about our decisions, we should not be influenced by like little modification in our decision setting. Recently I had this discussion with another professor, and he told me, well, the problem with the system 1 and system 2 thinking, so it kind of makes sense that nudges only work in quick decision making. Nevertheless, most likely 80–90% of our decisions are probably system 1, because there are very, very few decisions which are probably really system 2. Like he even said, making a decision for buying his house was probably a system 1 decision, because he made it quick and intuitively when he saw the house he wanted to buy. And he might be right. There might be very, very little decisions which are in fact system 2, but I leave this to judge for someone else. Second theory. So now we know in which context nudges are more likely to work. And something which is also important, because it also touches a little bit the ethical perspective, is the term of libertarian paternalism, and you might have heard that. So when, when nudging is discussed, this term sometimes comes up. So what does it mean? So it's kind of two things. On the one hand, it should keep the freedom of choice, something which has been mentioned before, that it doesn't use coercion, or no one has to do something. Decisions can also be reversed, and this would be like the libertarian spirit of those interventions. It's not like with economic incentive standards or regulation, which you need to follow. And it's paternalistic, which comes from the word parents, so paternal. It gives you a suggestion what to do, right? A nudge basically pushes you in some direction what either the policymaker wants, could also be used by private companies, etc. So kind of libertarian paternalism tells us two things. People have the freedom to make their own decisions. No one is forced to any decision, even though there's a suggestion made which you should do. So it's paternalistic, and the suggestions are made. I've mentioned that before. So the spirit is also usually to help people make better decisions, and better can be better with respect to their individual welfare, could also be better with respect to their societal welfare. Okay, so let's look at one question. So, and how could we tackle that with the policies I've just explained, or with the policy models? So I would like to encourage people to eat more sustainably, which could be that I try to convince people that they may reduce their meat consumption, or change to more plant-based diets, or something similar. So if you would ask an economist, who say, yeah, well, it's easy, then we just increase the cost of meat, or the cost of very high carbon food, which usually is meat. How could we do this? Well, we could implement taxes on meat. We could, for instance, do so through the changing the tax levels in which different food categories fall. I think at the moment meat is taxed with 8 or 10%. We could raise it to 20%, for instance. We could also do it through carbon taxes, because through carbon taxes we indirectly are going to tax meat when it's transported from far, at least. So some type of meat tax so a carbon tax would also have influence on our meat consumption. We could not only use taxes, but we could also work with subsidies. So we not only make something which has a lot of carbon emissions more expensive, but we could also make something which has very little carbon emissions cheaper. So we could put subsidies for fruits, vegetables, plant-based alternatives. So, but now comes the problem that all these measures I've been just talking about are at the moment at least not politically feasible. So we cannot do this. So it's very difficult to discuss the meat tax at the moment. I think clearly not, makes probably an interesting discussion, but very hard positions, very difficult. Same applies for carbon taxation. There is currently carbon taxation in Austria. Most likely it's probably gone in a couple of months, etc. Subsidies are a bit easier to discuss, but still it needs a lot of tax money to finance them. So what we could do, I can recommend you to read this article by my colleague Paul. Look into demand-side interventions with respect to trying softer interventions, such as nudging. So we could use social norms. We could tell people how many other people already eat less meat. We could reorder, like changing the choice architecture for setting, placing sustainable or plant-based meals on the top of menus. We could use visual cues. We could use carbon footprint labels, environmental labels in order to signal carbon-friendly meals, plant-based alternatives, etc. So this is what we can do at the moment. So to say, when you hear about nudges and that they are now, let's say, popular, it's not necessarily because we all love them. It's because we can use them at the moment, because all other alternatives are at least difficult or politically not feasible, etc. So it's just an additional toolbox of intervention we could use or can make use of for behavioral change. So now comes the bummer. So I've been talking about two views of human behavior. I've said it's great that we're not only rational, because there are many other motivators we have. If we know these motivators, we first should adjust traditional policy instruments, but on top of it, we have like new policy instruments, like behavioral public policy, nudges we can use. I've told you that many government agencies try to make their policies behavioral insight proof, try to enrich their intervention tools, their intervention sets with nudging or behavioral interventions. However, the bummer is that those nudges have very limited effect. Therefore, I personally can only recommend them as additional tools. So we should not only race into adopting those type of intervention or policies and forget that we should support carbon taxes or something else. Because the main bottleneck of these policies, if we look at, so we're interested in changing people's demand. However, on average, we know that nudges and behavioral interventions change demand by approximately 2 to 5%. That's not much, right? So if I change meat consumption by 2 or 3%, this is going to reduce greenhouse gas emission, but it's not going to do so, or at least not at the necessary speed we would like to have these emission reductions. If you think about the climate targets, 2040, 2050, being climate neutral and so on. So here you can see a couple of studies trying to also criticize those type of interventions. No reasons to expect large and consistent effects of nudge interventions. As it is to scale, which summarizes a lot of those interventions, no evidence for nudging after adjusting for publication bias. So meaning there are a lot of studies which find no effect. Then there are a lot of studies which find very moderate effects. And there might be a lot of studies which have never been published, which that's adjusting for publication bias, which probably have also found no effect of this intervention. So I think this is a little bit the caveat of those type of policies I've just explained you. Now let's give me the second ingredient. So I've given you the first ingredient, which was understanding behavior. And now I would like to give you like a bit of a toolbox in order to figure out what works to achieve behavioral change. Now there's a decision maker's dilemma. If you see this from a policy perspective, I might be able to do a lot of stuff. I could implement Social norm nudges, I can implement price discounts, additional information, eco-labels, etc., etc. So every challenge or every problem might have potentially a lot of good solutions, but time and funding is limited. So it would be good to select those interventions which work. Now this brings me to another subfield, which has become prominent in economics as much as in other fields, which is evaluation field studies, or also known under policy studies. And it covers a little bit of a trend to so-called evidence-based policy and decision making, which is the idea that political or policy or intervention decisions should be based on strictly defined objective evidence and at best justified by it. For this idea, or for this approach to economics and to policies, those three economists on the left, Banerjee, Duflo, and Kremer, have even received the Nobel Prize. So, because what they did, they brought evidence-based policy, evidence-based decision-making to development in economics, so to development interventions. What this field tries to figure out is policy assessment, intervention assessment methods aimed to explore whether and in what way policy objectives, outcomes have been pursued and or are achieved. So let's look into this. Let's look into a couple of questions and how they were answered. So here you see a couple of papers in environmental economics. And they have to try to evaluate those interventions. So for instance, a colleague of mine has looked into, do small discounts for public transport lead to behavior change among commuters? Maybe they don't work, maybe they do work. What impact do moral appeal nudges have on shifting the timing of electric vehicles or electric vehicle charging? Do carbon footprint labels encourage behavioral change towards more climate-friendly diets? Can nudges be used to reduce the amount of food waste in hotel restaurants? Do default nudges increase the uptake of green energy? So there's very little we know because the field is very new. So we know there's a new tool set, there are interventions we can use for behavioral change, but the question is, do they have an impact? I've shown you before. Many studies show moderate impacts or also no impact. So it would be good to have this evidence before we implement them. Let's look at this question in detail to kind of detail out what I meant with whether and what way. So for instance, if I have the research question, and I will show you the study a little later, do carbon footprint labels encourage behavioral change towards more climate-friendly diets? I mean, that's a good question. Why? It's a good question because the European Commission is at the moment discussing over and over again if it's going to introduce such type of labels. For instance, the European Commission, at least at the national level, we see something like Nutri-Scores. Nutri-Scores gives you information about the health impact of a product you buy. And it is mandated in up to 10 countries in the EU, I think in France, as much as in other countries. Carbon footprint label would do something similar, not with respect to the health impact, but with respect to the environmental impact of a product. But before the European Union mandates such a label, we probably should figure out if it works, right? Because the intention would be that this carbon footprint label, in fact, influences consumer demand with respect to those products. So understanding whether this has happened is about if there's a causal link. So can I make sure that if I put the carbon footprint label, or can I test that the carbon footprint label leads to a reduction of or to an increase in climate-friendly diets? Understanding in what way this has been achieved is asking if using some criteria, so if I put an intervention, I could be interested if this has been fair. So was everyone equally affected by it, high socioeconomic groups, low socioeconomic groups, etc. I could also be interested if it has been cost effective, how much did the intervention cost me, and what was the outcome with respect to emission reductions. And in what way, we could also even think a little bit more in detail. We could also explore why it led to behavioral change. So it's about the how or the mechanisms. This is always the more difficult question. And it's usually less explored in most papers. But two things, or one thing is are quite essential. So is there a causal link between an intervention, could be a label, could be a visual cue, could be some type of information, and the environmental friendly behavior I wanted to impact, so to say. The main problem of this causal link is causal inference. So what do I need? So, and this is really like a quick course in causal inference. What do I need to establish for causal inference? I need to answer two questions. I need to answer what has happened. So I intervene, I put a carbon label on some climate-friendly means, and then I can see if people really reduce their meat consumption in the Mensa. However, for causal analysis, I need to answer a second question. I need to answer what would the outcome have been if there had been no intervention. So I need two groups. It's like a medical randomized control trial. Someone gets the medicine and someone doesn't get the medicine. And for this, basically, the group of economists before Duflo et al., they got the Nobel Prize. They used medical RCTs. Someone gets medicine, no medicine, and put it onto social interventions. Like here, the medicine is the carbon footprint label. So there's one group who sees all the food with a label, and there's another group who will never see the label. And so I can answer two questions. What happens if there's a label, and what happens if there's no label? So I create what is in the literature called a counterfactual. So I try to answer the question, what would have happened to the untreated group? And I can do so by conducting field studies or experimental studies or so-called randomized control trials, and applied also to social sciences, which I think was the novelty in here. Okay, I'll try to show you one of my own studies on this in order to make this point clear. So we looked into these questions: do carbon footprint labels promote more climatarian diets? With climatarian diets, I just mean diets with a lower carbon footprint, less meat, more plant-based alternatives, more vegetarian, more pescatarian, etc. And we did so by using a field experiment. And I just realized I'll send my old set of slides. Let me see. Well, okay, will not be very beautiful, but probably you listen to me and abstract from what is written on the slide. I apologize, but this was my slide set from yesterday. Doesn't matter. Okay, why did we do this? We were interested because there's a growing awareness about people's diets and the impact on greenhouse gas emission. In fact, we know that roughly 28 to 30% of all our greenhouse gas emissions come from consumption, production of food. Another 50% comes from the consumption, production of meat. And within that category, another 50% comes from beef meat, basically. So it's very easy. If we would like to reduce our greenhouse impact from food, we should probably reduce meat consumption, and best we would reduce our beef consumption. Now, carbon labels, as I've just explained, is a quite common instrument in environmental policy. For instance, you might be used to energy efficiency labels. Those labels are around for many, many years, which indicate you how energy efficient is an appliance you buy. And the carbon label does something similar. It gives you a signal about the environmental quality of a product, and a carbon footprint label gives you a very clear signal about the average carbon footprint, in this case of a meal or of food. This is the label, in fact, we designed. It was not rocket science because we based labels on commonly used traffic light designs. Colors help people. If something is labeled red, this means it's a very high carbon footprint. If something is labeled green, this already signals the consumer, oh, this footprint of this meal is kind of okay, so don't worry too much. We designed this label, I said, I apologize for the slides, it's horrible. We designed this label joint with one of our partners. In fact, I can also tell you what can happen if you are a master student at the university. Anya designed this label. After she designed it for us, she founded a startup in life cycle analysis and has just sold her startup 5 years later for around £20 million, because there's a lot of demand of the food industry of carbon footprint labeling, and she's become highly successful with it. This was like the first try. The label has improved since then, but we also informed the design of the label with a short study among students, because with a label you have to make sure that people understand the label, because if people don't like the label, if they can read the label, if they can understand it, you probably cannot really, it's very unlikely that you will have an impact. So we did a little pre-survey among UK students in order to figure out if they like the label, if they understand it, etc. So this label, I have to say, I was not fully satisfied with it, because there's one thing which is nice, people understand it, because there's a very clear category from green to red. Something labeled as red is probably bad, something labeled as green is probably good. It also shows you the average footprint of a meal, 142 grams, which is not an easy figure. It's quite confusing. It's even for me difficult to interpret, even though I know now the carbon footprint of most meals of a UK Mensa. But people, so we figured out people like to see numbers because they can trust the number even if they cannot interpret it. So this was our so this is what we learned from that. Anyway, this is what we used. Yeah, I'm sorry, I said the slides are not formatted, just copy pasted from another presentation. Just look at the graphs. So what did we do? So we recruited 5 Mensas at the University of Cambridge. We called 3 of these Mensas treatment Mensas because they were willing to implement our label on all meals sold in this Mensa. And we called 2 of these Mensas control Mensas because we never implemented the label there. So we have our counterfactual. So we know what happens if we introduce it, and we know what happens if we don't introduce it. All of those 2 Mensas we follow for 2 university terms. University terms are different in the UK. They run from October till end of February. And we have roughly 40,000 people in both of the settings. The Mensas are of different size. This is why the treatment Mensas, there are 3 Mensas, 40,000 observations, because they are smaller Mensas as the control Mensas. All right, this is our very representative setting. We can talk about external validity, obviously, but we run this experiment with high elite students at the high elite university in very representative Mensas. You see here King's College. This is at least not, people are eating not for lunch there, but at least for dinner. Anyway, this is how it is. There are still humans in Cambridge, so there's something we can learn from it, I believe. Okay, this, I should have formatted it. Anyway, just listen to me. I think this will do the job. Okay, what do we find? So we have 80,000 observations. We have people coming to these Mensas for roughly 4 to 5 months. And we find a very modest but highly significant effect. So I think that's good. So we find we have 3 outcome variables. So we can check how much vegetarian they eat. We can check what's the average footprint of the meat, and we also classified meals by high and low carbon. Okay, most importantly, we see people change demand to vegetarian by roughly 2%. That's it, right? So that's what you get with a label, 2% of demand change. And note, we run this on a highly educated young sample. Basically, our expectation is if we run this with a representative sample, the effect most likely goes to 0. Because we run it on a sample who probably already have green preferences, who probably like to read those labels, who probably are familiar with labels. They're also more likely to be influenced by labels. And here the demand effect is like 2%. Very, very little. We can benchmark this to other interventions. These slides are horrible. I'm really sorry. So you really have to listen to me and don't watch on it. We also can check what's, so the average carbon footprint of the meal sold in those Mensas decreases by roughly 5%. This is not bad, given that the intervention is very, very cheap. In fact, when you would like to invest into mitigation, then we calculated that if you want to abate a ton of carbon, then you only need to invest about £30. That's very, very cheap. A lot of mitigation policies are way, way more expensive than 30 tons a pound. Nevertheless, most likely the effect on a representative sample is probably 0, as we have tested this on a very highly educated, young, etc. sample. Okay, I might just skip, let me just see. Oh, this is a bit more beautiful. Okay, second study, we did something similar, but we were not interested now in only carbon labels. We tried also other more nudge type interventions. And we also changed the setting. We are not in the Mensa anymore. We changed to food delivery apps. Many people order on delivery apps. We thought, okay, let's see. And those apps also have a lot of leverage points when it comes to interventions. And this time, we also want to do differently to our studies before, is that we not only wanted to do one intervention, like, okay, what is the effect of carbon label, but we tried different interventions. We tried a meat tax, so we increased proportionally the price of all meat dishes. We also implemented a carbon label and a typical nudge type of intervention. We reordered the menu. Customers found plant-based alternatives, low-impact meals at the top of the screen, so to say, and found meat dishes, high-impact carbon meals at the end of the menu. How did we do this? So this time we didn't go to Mensa, and we could not convince Deliveroo or Just Eat to do the experiment with us. So we designed our own food delivery app, which I will show you in a bit. In fact, it was programmed by the Behavioral Insight team. So it looks like Deliveroo, so to say. People were also incentivized. They got a budget to buy food. And in fact, we also shipped food to them while our student assistant did. So it was quite incentive compatible. But with that, we ourselves could basically program 3 different apps. So we had one app where we had a text. We had one app where people saw carbon footprint information. And we had one app where we reordered the menus. And roughly 4,000 people took part in our experiment. As said, we tried to make it as realistic as possible. I mean, the main difference to the setting before was in the field experiment, the students did not know that they're in a field study. No one told them. While in this setting, people knew that they're taking place in a study. They filled out an online survey and were then directed to our app platforms. This is our platform. So we had like 9 restaurants, world cuisine, I guess. This is what you saw when you clicked into such a restaurant. And this is also how our different platforms were designed. If there was a meat tax, people was quite salient. People were aware of the increase of price of what they bought. And if there was a label, this is the newest label by Footsteps, the company we worked with, people got some information how climate friendly is their meal changing. Yeah, they're still using color codes, as you can see, but they're also using some letter codes from A to E, trying to show the impact of your meal. Yeah, so my slides are getting worse, I think, by time, but yeah, you cannot see this. What did we find? Okay, 3 main learnings. Carbon labels didn't do anything in our setting. Why do we think so? Well, food delivery apps, people make very quick decisions. They don't take too much time or pay attention to extra information. People are in a rush. They just want to get the food. So carbon labels very ineffective in these type of platforms. Already remember, very modest impact in a restaurant setting. So that's not good if you think about all the discussion when it comes to implementing those labels. Meat tax, unfortunately, also not changing behavior. We have at least a thought why we think this is the case. One reason is that our meat tax was very moderate, so it led to price changes from 5 to 10%. I mean, 10% more on a meal we found quite sizable, but in our setting, it did not deter or move people into more vegetarian or more climate-friendly diets. Most successful and demand change from up to 12% was menu reordering. So basically, we learned people are just lazy to scroll down the screen. And let's say some hard interventions, changing what people see first, have a quite large impact in those type of settings. In fact, not only in online settings, we also know this from offline settings. We have colleagues in Cambridge who changed the architecture of the menus, and we know that it largely influences what people eat. So largely meaning, okay, so we are now at demand change of 10, 12%, but that's like 3 to 4 times as much as the information type of intervention I've shown you. Yeah, the conclusion, I'm not going to read this to you. Let me see. Yeah, I can still do. Okay, I will conclude with a couple of things. So now I've shown you how I can reach demand side changes with a type of new toolbox of policy. Okay, stepping one back is, there's also a lot of critique on this, right? As you can see here, a couple of articles. Lifestyle changes aren't enough to save the planet. Taking power as individuals, and why individuals climate action can't save us. To save the planet, we need more systematic change. Also Michael Mann, a climate scientist, who says We need systematic changes that will reduce everyone's carbon footprint, whether or not they care or they like it. Okay, that's quite a critique, right? So that's basically a critique. Should we change? Should everyone like live a bit of a more moderate lifestyle, or voluntarily agree that it's good to change to a plant-based diet, etc.? Yeah, I did not translate that. So what does it need besides individual change? How can we get more systematic change? Well, more systematic change, I think, is a mix of it. So I think what I like here is a lot what the World Resource Institute tells us. This says for a systematic change, yes, we need behavior change. We probably need shifts in norms. I've also shown you that this is possible, even though moderately so. We most likely need very strong institutions. We most likely also need strong regulations and economic incentives. We need leadership and most likely also innovations. When it comes to innovations, I can very much recommend you also to read the EA report, who tells us that all these calculations of net zero by 2050, 2040, they all rely on scenarios, on technologies which we don't even have invented yet. So about 30% of technologies on which these calculations are based that we can reach net zero 2050, they don't exist. So this means we probably have to speed up a little bit our innovation process. Okay, so let's imagine we would like to have all cars electric. We would like to have most energy from renewable sources, all buildings zero energy, less plastic, less meat consumption. What will make this possible? I've shown you information, moral obligation, nudges, education, voluntary lifestyle changes, technological standards. Probably yes and no. I've shown you quite modest effects of behavioral change interventions. I've shown you the limitations of technology, or we've talked about shortly technology improvements, energy efficiency changes. But what will most likely lead to very systematic changes is one instrument, and it's the CO2 price. And the CO2 price can come in two forms. It can come in the form of a carbon tax, or it can come in the form of an emission trading scheme. Why is it systematic? It's quite systematic because it changes the incentives in the entire market. It changes the incentives for consumers, for producers, for investors, for innovators across all sectors, all industries, all countries, if applied to many countries. That's quite a good instrument. The carbon label just tries to influence people when they buy food, like consumers when buying food. A CO2 price, all products we buy, all industries, all consumers, all producers, etc. So that's quite a systematic policy. This is also why it's rather good policy. Let's look at very quickly, 2-3 more minutes before wrapping up. Okay, where do we have CO2 prices at the moment? So here you can see a world map. And when I talk about carbon pricing, it could be two instruments, and countries either use both instruments. Sometimes they only use one of the two instruments. They could use a carbon tax, or they could use an emission trading scheme. Different colors gives you indication if countries use both. For instance, China in blue has just recently implemented an emission trading scheme. They don't have a carbon tax. They cover really a lot of emissions. In Europe, depending on the country, most countries have nowadays, they are within the European emission trading scheme, which covers some sectors, and on top of that, they also have a carbon tax. But most importantly is the last sentence. So how many emissions are we currently regulating by this one instrument? Currently, where we have very few initiatives, roughly 25% of all global emissions are already systematically, so to say, in one of those policy instruments. So to say, there's still room to tackle a couple of more emissions, but for that, more countries would have to implement one of the two instruments. Second fact, sorry, it's also still in German, because what you can see here is the countries which have a carbon tax, or one of the two. On the horizontal line, on the vertical line, we see how high the carbon tax is. It's very clear. I think 2/3 of the countries, the carbon tax is somewhere below $50. That's very, very little. There are very few countries, maybe 10 countries, where the carbon tax or the price for 1 ton of carbon is above that, above $50 or $60. And there are very, very few countries, probably 4 countries, where we have a carbon tax which is higher than $100 per ton of carbon. Why does this matter? So why does the price matter? Wouldn't you say, oh, right now we have carbon tax? Not really. First of all, if it's very low, it hardly changes consumption and production decisions, because if I just increase prices by 5%, hardly anyone is going to change which car to take, or if I take a bus, etc. So strong incentives give more incentives to consumers and producers to change their behavior. Very little incentives give very little incentive. Second, why is it important? If you look at the gray bar, this is the bar, the price corridor between 60 and 120. This is one corridor most countries should be in until 2030, and then it should further rise in order to kind of make it to net zero. So if you're not going to increase our prices, we can very much predict that we're not going to have sufficient behavioral change, adaptation of consumers and producers. And if you ask a couple of experts, not only economists, people who are at climate negotiations, etc., everyone agrees that we see too little prices, or prices at the lower end of carbon pricing. Last example, CO2 tax in Sweden. Interesting. So Sweden has a lot of good things. IKEA, ABBA, the royal family, Björn Borg, for those who play tennis. But they also have a very interesting carbon tax, and I'll try to explain this in 1 minute. Interestingly, it's one of the oldest carbon taxes. I think we have it for up to 20 years nowadays. So it was it must have been the first country in Europe to implement it. Also interesting, it's one of the highest carbon taxes we have. It's like around roughly $130 US. It's as high as in Switzerland, and I think Luxembourg also has a very high one. It's the only countries which are above $120 US. So since 20 years, Sweden gives a very strong incentives to change from high carbon energy to low carbon energy, because heating the air with fossil fuel really doesn't pay off anymore, because it's taxed super highly. Besides that, I mean, this came in a package, so to say. So Sweden did a couple of clever things. On the one hand, it implemented a carbon tax 20 years ago, and it started high. As you've seen, most countries start very low. Also, Austria started very low, right? The first phase of the carbon tax was 25 euros. Did anyone notice? Probably not, because it's a very, very small price adjustment. So they started 10 years ago, and they started very high. Plus, they kind of reformed the entire tax system, which clearly was beneficial. There was some changes in wealth inheritance tax, property taxes, reduction of corporate income taxes, and so on, etc. But it's a significant tax, because if you compare it to everything else, European emission trading scheme at the moment trades 1 ton of carbon for roughly 90 euros. Not bad, has increased a lot. Two economists, Nordhaus and Nicholas Stern, who also works at the LSE, they're very well known for their predictions or expert recommendations. How high should our carbon tax be? So it would, that we kind of reach all those temperature reductions and greenhouse gas emission reductions. So Nordhaus, he's a bit on the lower end. He says, well, 80 could be enough. Stern says, at least for the first corridor, we should at least reach 100. High-level commission says that until 2030, it should be at least 100. Said the Austrian tax at the moment started with 30. At the maximum, it will be 55, but probably by then it's already extinct. And the Swedish tax is very high. Result, this is the result. Sweden reduced CO2 emissions by 1/3 since 1990. That's a ton of emission. And they didn't do so because they woke up and changed their lifestyle, or there was information, or there were nudges, etc. They did so because there was a very clear high price incentive, and it was a systematic one. The fact that every consumer, every producer, every industry, every sector, etc. Why so difficult? So why do we see so little CO2 taxes around? Only 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions are taxed. And why do we see so many taxes with so little incentives? Well, many things. There's a lot of lobbying. Many people don't like taxes. There might be also behavioral reasons. People react to taxes not optimally because they're not rational or self-interest. There's always this discussion when it's about carbon pricing. Oh, should we use a tax or should we use emission trading? Both instruments are equivalent, but some of them are more politically feasible, some are a bit easier to administer, Others argue for a combined solution. There are always socioeconomic concerns about social justice, how are low-income groups affected, also about competition. Many industries fear carbon taxes because they might not be competitive against other countries which don't have carbon taxes. Political feasibility is a big one. We see carbon taxes if there are politicians who would like to have them, and in the next political cycle, we don't see carbon taxes because there are politicians who don't like them. And generally speaking, implementing taxes is never in the great interest of any politician because he wants to be re-elected, and he knows that usually citizens also don't like increase of taxes. And there's also a problem of international coordination. So at best, we would see a global carbon tax, but at the moment, we just see cluttered initiatives of different countries. Okay, so let me summarize. At least my last slide was formatted well. So what I've tried to show you that the motivation for action in climate protection or behavior is multifaceted. There are different views, a rational view, more behavioral economic view. I've introduced you a bit of a new toolbox, so-called nudges, behavioral public policy, which are interventions which can encourage small behavioral shifts or behavioral change. But I've also shown you a big caveat that might not be sufficient on their own to drive large systematic changes. I've also given you another ingredient besides showing you an additional toolbox which can be used to ignite behavior change. I've tried to show you a couple of field studies, some of my own, so-called evidence-based studies. So let's trial a couple of interventions before we implement them, because it could be that those interventions might not have any effect. And so it's probably better we don't scale them up and use them systematically. And I've tried to end my talk with coming back to a very rational instrument, because CO2 pricing is a quite rational instrument because it tackles people's income and people's cost-benefit weights. But I've tried to make the point that it's a key instrument for systematic change at the broad scale if implemented like high enough, saying if it is a very big incentive and not a small incentive, and at best it would be globally coordinated, which is also not the case. The overall picture is we have a lot of interventions, and we will never see interventions in isolation. So CO2 pricing alone is a very good instrument, and we should use it, but we probably need a lot more. We probably need education, like a bottom-up instrument. We need innovation, so we have to put money there, because 1/3 of the technologies we apparently need, we haven't even invented. We need good institutions, good democracies, regulation standards, etc. So what we best see is a policy mix, but most likely CO2 pricing should be part of it. Otherwise, I'm not very optimistic that we're going to reach our net zero goals 2040, 2050. And with that, thanks for listening and looking forward to your questions.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I'll come up with the microphone. And for the online audience, please type in the chat and we can read your questions and ask here in the audience hall. Any questions? They're up there.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I have a question about the economy for. I looked it up, the English word for it, because I don't know. But do you speak German?
Yeah.
The Gemeinwohlökonomie. What's the English word for it?
Yeah, that's a good one. Not on the top of my head, but
Common,
for
the Commonwealth, and so what is your opinion on that?
I don't know. So I know the Gemeinwohlökonomie. I'm not sure now about its exact propositions. You might be able to remind me about the broad idea.
So it's similar to the taxes, kind of, but oh no, actually not. It's like you get money for doing good things for the community and for the environment.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So yeah, exactly. I'm not 100% familiar with it. I think also the Gemeinwohlökonomie or standard economics, I mean, they're pursuing the same objective. The question is how we get there. Standard economics was quite hard approach now, CO2 taxes, let's just price it out, etc. I think Gemeinwohlökonomie would probably even disagree with carbon taxes and would maybe even disagree with what I've said about GDP. Maybe that no economic growth is necessary. So I think these are different viewpoints, and I believe we probably meet somewhere in the middle. I've shown one view, but for instance, both approaches have, I mean, at the end, I've argued about economic growth. Let's just take this as an example. But economic growth is just, it will be an outcome. Now there's a lot of discussion, should we degrow, should we grow? Is this good for emissions? I think it's interesting to look what history has told us, that the two correlate widely. I think we can learn a lot from that. But we should not necessarily focus it as the main outcome. I think if we focus, for instance, on the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, if we try to look at that no one should be in poverty, that we have climate action. So if these are our outcomes, then this might come with growth, or it might not come with growth. Some sectors will degrow, some industries will go down, right? Fossil fuel industry will go down. So that's kind of, so we will degrow some sectors. Other sectors might grow, right? So a lot of clean energy, those sectors will probably see, most likely, a lot of growth. But this will be an outcome if we focus on the right objectives. And if the objective is to reduce greenhouse gas emission, we should focus on that. Everything else will come, most likely. And if we kind of respect all other SDGs to some extent. But this is more my view as a holistic answer to that. So most likely we will see probably a combination of Gemeinwohlökonomie, standard economics, so to say. There might be other theories.
Yeah, I think that's a true point. And also there was one of your conclusion the policy makes, and I totally agree on that. And then I actually have one comment because I also learned that it's right now, currently it's important that we focus on convincing the people who already know and believe in the problem of the climate change, that we should focus on getting them to act, because it's already, because there are a lot of people who know about the climate change but don't do it or don't do anything against it, instead of focusing on the few people who still you can't get on board to fight the climate change.
Just a quick thought on it. I've been talking a lot about top-down measures today, which is taxes, interventions, but clearly I think what you're saying, and it has been left out a bit by my talk, is I think a very big lever is a bottom-up education, so that I think education is still the best or a very good leverage point where we can tell people that SDGs are important, the environment is important as much as other goals, and at best we all agree on it. So I think besides this policy mix, which is clearly top-down, bottom-up education, I think this was also the point you made a little bit, is quite important. I agree.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And for those who are interested in this Gemeinwohlökonomie, there is a lecture recorded on this topic. Just have a look on the YouTube channel. There you'll find the recording about this. You can inform more about it. There's a question?
I have a question regarding the CO2 taxation. What happens with the taxes? What happens with the taxes? Because I think it's kind of important to reinvest this money in their climate, so something to do for climate change or against it, however you phrase it. Is there already something in the EU that states that these kind of taxes have to be used?
So this is a very good point. I think there are two remarks to that. It's true, people like, if you see a CO2 tax, we would like that many people like that this money is used for environmental projects, initiatives, research, etc. We will call this earmarking. So we take this tax money and then we know this tax money goes into green projects. Nevertheless, there's no CO2 tax around. Also, the EU is not planning one at the moment, at least, where this earmarking is mandatory, so to say. But we know that in most countries, politicians do it because it increases citizens' approval for taxes as much as yours, if I believe. If you know that this money is used for green projects, then I'm more likely to vote for it. From an economics point of view, in fact, it's not very efficient. Why? If you think about the budget of a government, so now it gets budget from the CO2 tax, it gets a lot of money, and it can only use it for green projects. But what happens if it needs money for education? Because this year we have a school reform, and now it doesn't have the money, and this money is stuck here. So if you think how our government runs, for government it's always good if all the taxes come back and they can use it where it's needed. And this is why earmarking is so to say inefficient from a budgeting perspective. Nevertheless, most countries in fact do earmark it. Austria has earmarked it to use it for revenue recycling, to recycle it back partially. Other countries have earmarked it, and we see this in a lot of surveys, that people agree more with such a tax if the money flows into green projects, etc. So I believe most taxes we're going to see in the future, if there will be new ones, or if the European Union at the moment has the emission trading scheme, so it's not thinking about a tax, will be with some type of earmarking you have mentioned, but only because it increases approval, not necessarily because it's good from how the budget is run, so to say. So I totally agree with the sense of it, that money should be used for innovation, research, green projects, but you can also constrain a government with it. So that's a bit the point.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question?
But what is the Klimabonus in Austria? Isn't it the Klimabonus?
Yeah.
Is it linked to this carbon tax? Or?
So yes, it is linked to it. In a sense, you only get it because you have there is the carbon taxation, and even the revenues from the carbon tax are used for the revenue recycling. So you call this revenue recycling. So it flows back. So the exact money you take, you cycle back. In fact, in Austria, it was even more money which was recycled back than it was coming in from the tax, which was in its design probably not very clever. But yeah, it has also to do something with earmarking. They basically said, okay, all the money we get from the tax, we recycle back to the households. So it's similar in the intent what has been asked before. Yeah.
There is two questions in the online participant. What was the foundation to classify the green to red CO2 scale in meals? Is plant-based food, for example, always green, or is the influence of the amount of processing important as well? For example, high protein, powder, flour in plant-based foods? That was the first question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understood everything correctly, but so the life cycle analysis of the footprint label was done by the company. They use like standard life cycle analysis for it, and there are tables for UK food. So UK kitchen is quite a nice country to do that because there's not so much variety in it. So, nevertheless, this startup, they had to decide a lot on how to calculate this. Other people might come up with other calculations. But you have to see a label like as a rough classification where a lot of food comes out, where the footprint is red a little. And obviously the footprint will depend on the methods you apply, on where do you close the circle, what do you assume, which fuel was used for the truck, etc. So it's quite sensitive. But the rough calculation into something is rather good and something is rather bad for the climate, I think usually comes out of most methodologies. This is how much I understand from LSE, life cycle analysis. And the second question was linked to how healthy this food is, right? So we looked at this in our second study. I don't remember it in detail, but we were interested in if people change to a climate-friendly diet, does this mean they will now eat more unhealthy, in fact? Also, they have an unbalanced diet with respect to proteins, and that's not necessarily the case. So because we also calculate the Nutri-score for every meal, and we don't see any change in the average health intake, even if we made people eat more climate-friendly. This is at least what we found, but not sure if this was sufficient. Yeah.
And there's a second question, which is, do you think science can influence politics enough to implement the tax, even though the political parties in power are not convinced yet?
Oh, I don't think science can influence politics, no. I wish, but very little. It has become more, I think, science-based recommendations or evidence-based policy has become popular, so to say. So I do think that there are a lot of politicians, parties listening to evidence. I mean, if you look at the last government, Martin Kocher, he was professor here in Innsbruck before, an economist, now took over the employment minister. He was Minister of Labor for a couple of years, so he was quite open. He was a behavioral economist himself, so I think he was listening to a lot of evidence. And I think as far as what I know from him, he also influenced his colleagues there. So yeah, I think politicians are open to evidence, but usually they act on voters' preferences. So there's some, yeah, so I'm hopeful that evidence is considered more. This is at least what I've seen the last years, but generally speaking, when it comes to carbon taxes, politicians at the moment are just constrained by the voters' will.
Yeah, other questions? I don't see any. So, yeah, we just ran out of time. So thank you for coming. Thank you for the discussion. Oh, there is some question.
Hey, with the carbon taxing, I was wondering, how do you tackle products that are imported into a country? How do you tackle those? Because I could see that industries maybe leave the country, or just like highly CO2 extensive industries just get imported then?
I mean, there are different mechanisms. The European Union is obviously aware of that. It has a European emission trading scheme, which already deters some industries that say, oh, we are in this scheme and I could produce in China, etc. So how to tackle that problem? The European Union wants to implement something which is called carbon border adjustment, which basically, if steel from China is imported, there's a carbon tax on the border, and so this company knows that even if it would produce in China, it would pay the same carbon tax as it would pay in Germany, for instance. It's called carbon border adjustment. It is in its introduction, so to say. So yes, people are concerned about it, and yes, there are, so to say, solutions to it. The best solution would be if we have a global carbon tax, so we don't need carbon border adjustment. But this is not the world we live in. We have scattered carbon taxes and schemes. So carbon border adjustment, basically taxing those goods on the border, like tariffs. So they cost the same, and it wouldn't make sense for the industry to leave. To make sense, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we really have to stop now because the next lecture will start. Thank you for coming, and see you next time here in the lecture hall. Goodbye. Thank you.